Good afternoon. I'm here with my guest, poet Richard Fox. Welcome, Richard.
Nice to be here, Doug. Thank you for having me.
Richard is Fox was born and bred in Worcester. He attended Webster University as much an artist colony as a college in the early 70s. These diverse cultures shaped his worldview and love of words. He is former president of Poetry Oasis, Inc., a nonprofit association dedicated to education and promoting local poets, and was managing editor of its journal, Diner. Richard's poems have appeared in numerous journals, including Above Place, Boston Literary Magazine, OVS, Poetry Quarterly, Midstream Magazine, Worcester Review, and he reminded me that we published him a while back in Ibbotson Street. He's the author of two poetry collections, Time Bomb and Wandering in Puzzle Boxes. A cancer survivor, many of Richard's poems focus on cancer from the patient's point of view, drawing on hope, humor, and unforeseen gifts. He seconds Stanley Kunitz's notion that people in Worcester are provoked to poetry. I've got some questions for you. Now, first off, I like that last quote. You said Kunitz said people in Worcester are provoked to poetry, and you're from Worcester. Why is that? Why do you think he says that? What is it about that?
Well, while he was poet laureate, he came back to Worcester, and his boyhood home is in Worcester, and there's a lot of poetry events out of that house. The people who own the house now treat it like a museum. But he was asked by someone in the press, why are there so many poets in Worcester? And he paused, and being Stanley Kunitz, he said, people in Worcester are provoked to poetry. That immediately went on all the Slam Team T-shirts. But I think Worcester has more writers than you would think for the size of the city, and I'm not really sure what
I've
does
interviewed a good, very fine Worcester poet, John Hodgson.
Oh yeah.
Here, and I think he blurbed your book, right, or one of your books.
Yeah, actually, yeah. John, I've worked with John's my mentor, and I've been working with him for, over 15 years.
Okay.
And he also edited my first book.
Okay.
But I don't know if it's the atmosphere of Worcester, if it's the blue-collar feel in Worcester, if it's the ethnicity. But Worcester turns out a lot of writers. I like to say that, your server could very well be a poet. Your dentist could very well be a poet, which could be dangerous if your dentist is thinking about verses while drilling your tooth. But poetry seems to be everywhere in the city.
Okay. Did you grow up in a poetic background?
I didn't grow up in a poetic background. I grew up with a love of poetry. I call him an uncle. He's my mother's cousin, who was a Beat and introduced me to a lot of the Beat poets and a lot of the Beat art and literature. So he really
sort of the resident bohemian of the family, kind of.
Yeah, he was an interesting guy. He was a bombardier on B-24s during World War II. Came home, went to RISD on the GI Bill, moved into Greenwich Village, and supported himself as a painter.
His whole life? Yeah.
His whole life, yeah.
Wow. Of note? A painter of note?
I mean, his stuff's out there. He wasn't like a major name, but he produced a body of work that continually sold. He would go around the village and with a pad and charcoal, and he'd draw people or he'd draw scenes, and then he'd go back and paint them.
Interesting. Now, can you tell us a bit about your stint with Poetry Oasis and Diner magazine?
Yeah, Poetry Oasis had a weekly venue, and we brought in a really nice selection of noted poets, mostly in New England, but some people who were coming through nationally. We had a strong open mic, and we also ran workshops in various areas, schools, senior centers, where we could be of help. I was really proud of the Open because I think there were a lot of poets who learned from each other and developed their style, developed their, I hate to use the word, their voice. Because we had everything from Latino poets who'd come in and read their poem in English and in Spanish, to slam poets, to really religious page poets. We had a nun who used to come in. And there was an acceptance of the diversity of style, and there was a lot of support, especially for people standing up to read a poem out loud for the first time in a venue.
This is important.
Yeah, it's a very hard thing, and there was a lot of love given. If someone was coming for the first time, there's a lot of love given by the audience and a lot of positive reaction.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Diner was quite a project. Came out 4 times a year initially, and we ended up getting. This is really before the internet really
took off.
Yeah, I mean it was still out there, but we had things like in magazines, and we got a very wide distribution of poems, and we had two poetry editors who had.
Eve Rifka was one.
Eve Rifka. Here I'm going to go with my name deafness. I'll come up with her name. Who had a very specific idea of what they wanted the journal to be, and they would pick poems within that context.
Okay. Now, in your book, I didn't read Time Bomb, but I did read Wandering in Puzzle Boxes. You take an air, and that's published by the fine press Big Table Books with Robin Stratton.
Yes.
Genius behind that, right?
Robin's the best.
Robin's the best. You take an unsparing eye to yourself in your poetry in regard to the ravages of cancer. And why did you want to revisit such a painful part of your life? What is it about? A catharsis, or I don't know.
I think I have a friend who was a medic in Vietnam, and I would talk to him on the phone while I was going through the whole experience, and he said to me, you're fighting a war. To him, his defining time were the 10 months he was in Vietnam before he got injured. I think if you go through cancer treatment and you come out the other side, it becomes a defining moment in your life. When I began writing,
what is it? I mean, you face mortality, your own mortality, your own vulnerability. What is?
Don White one time asked me, did cancer change you? And because life is incremental, it's really hard for me to look back at the me before cancer and the me after cancer. I mean, there are some changes. I wake up in the morning, and I feel like I'm funky. I don't feel good, and it takes me but a moment to say, yeah, but you're alive, and I'm not going to waste this day. I always try to have that attitude about not wasting days, but now it's really in me after going through treatment and after seeing people who were in treatment with me not make it. But when I first started writing, it took me a long time. It took me about 15 months before I could really read and write poetry. Poetry's not straightforward reading, and my brain just couldn't assemble it. But what happened was I talked to John Hodgen, and I said, John, send me some prompts. And John is a master of writing prompts and assignments. So he sent me them, and I would write towards the prompt, or I would write towards the form. And in both cases, I'm thinking more about the prompt, or I'm thinking more about the form, be it Sestina, a villanelle, than I am about the subject matter that I'm writing. My subconscious is thinking about that, but my conscious mind is working on the form or working on the prompt as a puzzle. And that's what came out of me.
Okay. And so, so basically you wanted to revisit this in your poetry because?
I didn't so much intentionally at first go out to revisit these moments. It's just what was occupying my subconscious, and if I need to write a poem, I have a poem called Chemo Brain that essentially is, it's in a monospace font. It's a square with no extra spacing. So to me, I was a computer programmer for many years. To me, it's almost like a programming problem. But I start writing it, and with the idea of writing about peppermint tea somehow. And it turns out to be a poem about, having chemo brain with peppermint tea as an element. It was a defining moment in that it was a bigger challenge, I think, than almost anything I've gone through in my life.
Now, did you? I mean, it would seem to me that did you read this to other cancer patients? Have you read it? To other people who are afflicted with cancer?
I've read to other people who are afflicted with cancer. I've done poetry readings, which are just entirely about cancer, and the Q&A ends up being half about the poems and half about going through cancer. When I was going through treatment, I had friends and cousins who were veterans of cancer, and they basically held my hand. We talked, we emailed. They would tell me things like, be gentle to yourself, and they could really understand what I was going through. So I reach out to people now going through treatment, to give that to them. Because unless you've been there, you really can't understand. And unless you've been there, you can't talk to the patient. You know what it feels like. And the big thing is to know that what you're feeling is not unusual. It's not unique. It's normal. What you're going through emotionally is normal. Mm-hmm. And that's a hard thing to know. Because I think most people I've known who go through cancer feel like they have to push harder and they have to fight harder, and your body has a lot of demands on it from chemo and radiation, and it's got to continue to rebuild itself, and you don't have a lot of strength, so you have to learn to pick, your battles essentially.
Mm-hmm. I noticed that there was a poem where you writing about Israel Horowitz's lecture, tirade at your college back in the late 60s. I think it was
high school.
It was high school. And I interviewed Israel Horovitz, by the way. And I noticed, could you tell us a bit about that?
Sure. In high school, I was very lucky to have a theater teacher named Ray Janess. Ray had been an off-Broadway director and actor, and he got married again, and he decided he wanted the marriage to work, so he came up to Worcester to teach. He basically treated the high school students like professional actors. He ran us through various exercises and various things to teach us how to act. Another thing he did was he had a one-act play writing competition, and a number of us would write one-act plays, and he would send them down to, I think it was Elaine May, Israel Horovitz, Terrence McNally, Leonard Melfi, really top-notch playwrights who would then pick the winner. But they would also come up and they would also give a lecture to the entire student body. Well, Israel being in 1968, doing a lot of improvisational, basically got on the stage and decided rather than talk about theater, to be theater. And the first thing he said was, "Will you strike the school?" And got everybody's attention. And he basically improvised, about what was happening in 1968, the Vietnam War.
And did he throw a table or across it?
Near the end, he threw a chair, across the stage. And, there were people who were very angry. There were the few of us who had already joined the anti-war movement who were delirious. But Ray Janess, was talking to Israel about that recently. Israel and Ray still work together. Ray runs a theater in Gloucester. And Israel said, "Did I really throw a chair across the stage?" And Ray said, "Yeah, you really did."
And people were angry about that, or?
Well, the student body at the time was, was pro-war, crew cut, and then there were a few long hairs, who were against the war.
You were one of the remaining students there.
Yeah, I mean, I was one of the ostracized students for for being anti-war. But the interesting thing was, I went back to high school reunion, and these same people who were so fervently pro-war, one of them came to me and said, you were right. And the other thing I noticed was when they had a lottery number, all of a sudden, and a draft card, all of a sudden they were in opposition to the war for personal reasons, not for ethical reasons.
Savant Suave, it's about your, I was interested in this poem because I'm always in coffee shops, and, they have these sort of callow baristas who you were in the midst of, recovering from cancer.
That's really a poem more about observing a father and a son.
Oh, okay, I misread it then. I thought it was...
At Starbucks.
Okay, because there was... Okay, so tell me about that poem. It seemed to be a mixture of serenity and anger in that one.
Well, I'm sort of projecting, but it was a young boy who I could see was doing math, a really high level of math for a high school student, math that I didn't understand. Yeah. So anyway, which doesn't mean a lot. Yeah. But with his father, and he was autistic, I'm assuming, but the baristas all treated him nicely, and they'd call it up, and he would call his father Da. But I was noticing his interaction with other teenagers in the room, and that kind of created a story for me.
Oh, I didn't know why I got it confused. That I thought it was you coming into a coffee shop, and you were in sort of you were in sort of disabled or something at that time, and I guess I didn't read it closely enough.
I read a lot from first person, and
so it might have confused me, but it was a good one. I mean, and there was one where when you were a patient, you just sized up a nurse by these particular details that I thought was very good, and you just said, and you sort of formed a little life out of that. Can you tell me about that poem a bit?
About help, I've fallen down and can't get up. It was about my, God bless nurses. I was taking, my chemo cocktail had an element in it called cisplatin, which is made from platinum. And about 20% of the people who take cisplatin, their white cell blood count drops really to zero. So, you're very susceptible to any kind of infection. And I went into the local Worcester hospital rather than coming into Dana-Farber and Brigham and Women's. And I was being treated for the infection with IV antibiotics, but I had a sign on the door. There was a sign on the door: gloves, masks, keep the door shut. And I got friendly with the guy who would come in and clean the room, and he and I would talk my little bit of Spanish. But he always came in, all covered. My nurse came in all covered. But the hospitalist was a general physician who only works with patients in the hospital, came in without anything on, with all her medical students ungloved, unmasked. And I had a portacath, which is where the chemo and all my medications go in, and all my blood came out. Oncologists love blood. And she thought that she should inspect it, and she just tore it open and then just kind of with bare hands and pat it in place. And it's an area that is highly likely to get infected. But she also was coughing, and I was really upset. But
there was another poem though where someone came into your room, and you just sort of sized the individual up by what she was wearing, perhaps a bit poorly, should have kids by now. That's what I was talking about too.
Different poem. That's actually an occupational therapist, and I was looking at the occupational therapist through my mother's eyes. We were going in for her to have an OT driving occupational therapy driving test to see whether or not she could regain her license. Mm-hmm. And I was just trying to look through my mother's eyes and size up what the occupational therapist looked like to her.
Okay. And so you got into the head of your mother was sort of a persona poem.
Yeah.
Yeah, interesting. Why don't you read from some of your work, whatever you want to read.
Okay.
And this again is Wandering in Puzzle Box. It's from Big Table Books, and available at Amazon and
Well, primarily at smallpoetatlarge.com.
and come out. You can have a reading with you're having a reading this Saturday with
Yeah.
with now I can't remember his
With
name.
Glenn Bowie and Keith Tornham.
Right, all Big Table authors, and this is at the Newton Writing and Publishing Center. You'll find it online at newtonwritingpublishingcenter.com. Okay.
And it's a book release for all three of us, and there will be cake.
There will be cake.
In addition to being a great publisher, Robin Stratton supplies the best cake. I'm just going to read the first poem in my first book, Time Bomb.
Tell us that came out from who?
That was self-published after I had cancer, and I was eager to get a book out as quickly as I could because at that point in time, I really didn't know, how. I mean, first of all, how long my brain was going to function well, and from all the treatment, and secondly, how long I would live.
Okay.
So, I consider I'm in extra innings now. Every day is a bonus.
On borrowed time.
On given time.
On given time.
Excuse me. One of the prompts John Hodgson gave me was imagine a genius doing something trivial, something in everyday life. So I went to John Lennon. This is called John Lennon Writes a Note to Sean's Teacher. Dear Mrs. Goodenberry, Sean was absent from school yesterday. I might say he was ill, but that'd be a lie. We kept him home because he was, well, naked and lying on an empty canvas in Yoko's studio. He dipped his palms in paint, spun in circles, ovals, diamonds, using elbows, knees, forehead, backside, even his penis to draw daydreams. By the time he was bored, it was too late to get the paint washed off. I once got in trouble in art school for coming into class with oils and charcoal all over my kit. Didn't want Sean to go through the same grief, nor you, because you are a gentle soul who follows the rules and tries to act stern. Encloses a Polaroid of the canvas, far beyond a boy's homework assignment. Ta for now, peace and love, John.
Good.
And I'll do a cancer poem. We were kind of talking about this. I had a friend I was talking to who asked me, was I concerned about becoming addicted to the opiates? I was on a tremendous amount of painkillers, morphine patches, or I had a stomach tube because I couldn't swallow, but all kinds of opiates going down there. And I said to her, the painkillers didn't make me feel good. They made me feel less horrible and very foggy. So I couldn't wait to get off of them. But they never were, never felt abusable, I guess is a way to look at it. Mm-hmm. But then I was thinking about it a little bit more, and I was thinking about the other drugs I did receive, and mainly the chemotherapy. Mm-hmm. And I had a cocktail of 3 drugs, the primary one being the cisplatin. And for lack of a better way, saying it in the 60s way, you get off on the chemotherapy. You feel it in your body the next few days, but you feel it. I felt it in my mind, as it was going in. Not that I'm saying it's a good feeling, but you could definitely feel its effect. Mm-hmm. So I wound up with this poem entitled, My Infusion Nurse Smiles as She Releases the Clamp on My PICC Line and Invites Cisplatin in. Veins chill at the port. I shuck off a shiver. Earns me a hot blanket, cup of tea. Tongue tingles. A creeping plows the skull. Just below, where the bald spot roamed. Drink my cup, creeping seeps deeper. A pulsing tick adheres to the brain. Shut my eyes, stale air. The IV pump whirs, thrilling scale. A familiar tune, a familiar room. My nurse brings bottles of water. 5 minutes since I peed. Swallow flat, metallic fluid. Tick embraces entire cortex. Stem emits cotton, yes cotton, drip by drip engulfs each lobe. The nerves limp, bump in line. Try to read a paragraph, sentences, dug ditches. Sunshine pours in southern panes. Ice forms on roofs, snow. Melts and freezes, melts and freezes. I am cotton ball brain. It feels. Lights have halos. Fan tickles my skin. My stomach trills. I fart. Nurse buttons my wool shirt. I have 3 blankets tucked about me. Boston Red Sox cap. Freezer boots. Rabbit-lined gloves wait on the table. Wind whacks the building. Rails windows. I clasp my elbows prepped for winter.
You have these short clip lines. Is there for effect?
That's
For the confusion?
That's the way you begin thinking. The way I began thinking, and the way oftentimes I would get, I'd lose my train of thought.
Okay, yeah, so it's effective. Yeah.
Thanks.
I think you have time for another one.
Anything you particularly like to hear, or?
No, lay it on us.
Okay, I'm going to go with the first poem in the book. My dad died a year ago, May. Actually,
Yeskadol, Yeskados.
I'm sorry?
Yeskadol, Yeskados.
Yeah. And as I was going up on the stage, the synagogue, I realized it was the same bima as where I was bar mitzvahed, and I realized it was 48 years to the day. My dad visited me during the book, and he's in a lot of poems. Unintentionally, he just decided to visit, which was nice. This first one is called the first poem of the book. It's called Tefillah Echad, which means prayer one. There are 3 poems of this type, and they're not prayers; they're about prayer.
Okay.
Chant sacred words, cradle syllables in a sphere of air over tongue. Dad is dying, doesn't know my kiss. Chant slowly, all-tone steps, toe to heel. He has lived more than 90 years, children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren. Every breath saturates my lungs, seeps out for a full blessing. Longer silence between ears throbbing. Seek their harmony fluttering in chest. Dad's image rests on the back of shut eyelids. A slideshow of snaps, time to pulse. Scan the topography of prayer. Savor each utterance. In dim shadows, light slithers up the spine. The floor I sit on extends to dirt, body not being held as separate. I am grateful for every year of Dad's life. Thanks offered as I plunge into flashes of yearning, grace, surrender to what was, what is, what will be, pursuing favors not for myself, rather mercy for strangers. We are but one another's guests, spirits wandering in puzzle boxes, hungering to stay and to return.
Thank you, Richard Fox, for being on Poet to Poet.
Thanks for having me, Doug.